Mad Scientist versus Anti-Natalists. With your humble host, Warbles on a lot, in the role of Mad Scientist. And I have to say that until maybe a couple of months ago, I'd never heard of the Anti-Natalist movement. I found it via friend activity on YouTube. I've paid a bit of attention to several of the Anti-Natalists, and they have a few different arguments. There's not a lot of agreement between them. DerivedEnergy seems to say that life involves suffering and suffering is bad, therefore life is bad. AlabamAnomaly says that life involves unfulfillable needs and therefore life is bad. Gary in Medham, who seems to be the patron saint of the Anti-Natalists, at least he's been immortalised in clay sculpture, he says that life is nothing but addiction and cannibalism. And a fellow called SkidRowRadio, who seems to make the most sense out of any of them, he says that humanity has stuffed the planet and we should aim at voluntary extinction. Okay, that's what they say their rave is about. One of the few points that the anti-natalists do appear to agree on among themselves is that they all are atheists, and they don't appear to believe in any form of human soul, and they don't draw any distinction between preconception and post-mortem. They are basically interested in aiming at an absence of life, because life involves suffering and therefore they don't want to have any life. So they're aiming at a lifeless state, and being lifeless is one of the definitions of death. So they're actually aiming at and attracted by and fantasising about death for all. Now, necros is Latin for death, and philos is Latin for love. So if you love death, then you technically qualify as a necrophiliac, and they get a bit upset when I've left comments suggesting that they're a bunch of necrophiliacs, but they are in love with death, they spurn life, and they qualify for the term, so they should just get used to it, you know, like if it fits, wear it. As such, the anti-natalists are attempting to reduce everything to nothing. So they also technically qualify as attempting to reduce everything to nil, and therefore thus and because they're a bunch of nihilists. Now the nihilists were the decadent French philosophers who convinced Pol Pot to set up his killing fields, and they get a bit upset when I point out that they're not only necrophiliacs but they're nihilists as well. But facts are facts, you know, like birds of a feather flock together. From what I understand, the factor that draws the anti-natalists together is their shared perception that life is nothing but unremitting suffering. And the only way to create an adolescent or an adult who has that viewpoint is to give a baby and then an infant and a child an experience of a joyless environment. That way you can create an adult who doesn't understand that life is more than suffering. Life is suffering plus or minus joy, and generally the joy outweighs the suffering. But life is more than mere suffering, it's more than unfulfillable wants rather than unfulfillable needs. You know, life has a lot of joy in it, unless you've got a really bitter and twisted view of the universe. And a lot of people have got a really bitter and twisted view of the universe, because a human infant requires 36 moments of eye contact per minute of wakefulness for the first 3.5 years of life, right? 25 moments of eye contact per minute is a bare minimum for a well-adjusted human infant, right? A chimpanzee looks at the group leader 25 times a minute. So they reckon that's the bare minimum for a human. Optimum, the human requires 36 moments of eye contact with a regular, loving carer. And because the double income mortgage fantasy means that the kid's in long stay daycare when it's supposed to be being breastfed, and it's probably getting 1/5 of the care available from an $8 an hour minimum training wage high school dropout, it's pretty fashionable to have kids that raise themselves in a brat pack in the sandpit, and it's pretty easy for an intelligent, sensitive kid to grow up believing that life is nothing but unremitting suffering and lack of attention and lack of affection. It's a modern condition. And I'm sorry about that, but I didn't raise my kids that way. Without exception, the anti-natalists have got a bit cranky with me on the comment threads when I've pointed out to them that anti-natalism is not so much a philosophy as a subclinical semi-suicidal depression. They don't like to consider that there's a cause-effect thing going on where their perception that life is unremitting suffering is caused by their experience of life, which was substandard. They've had a shitty childhood. And they don't want to admit that it's affecting their view of the world. Gee, they're going to have to get over that. At some point, they're going to have to get their head around the idea that denial and rationalisation and projection are three of the most unhealthy ego defence mechanisms in the psychiatric textbook. And sophistry doesn't help, and neither does pedantry. You know, you've got to look in the mirror and then look at the rest of the world and figure out where you stand. Maybe the rest of the world's mad and you're not. You know, that was my decision. Now, I mentioned that in my view, anti-natalism is a semi-suicidal cult. But they all get really cranky anytime you mention the idea that, well, if you really hate life that much, you know, how come you haven't topped yourself? And they fizz bang pop, you're not supposed to mention that idea. It's deeply upsetting to them. The patron saint of anti-natalism, Gary in Mendham, apparently the reason that he doesn't kill himself is because he's got to feed his cat. Right? Well, okay, some people like cats. You know? Here on the Endangered-Species Sanctuary, if a cat comes within 500 metres of my place, the local white-winged chuffs split into two mobs of 6, and one mob dive bombs the cat, the other mob comes and jumps up and down on the roof of my hut, and they call, man, man, man come, man, cat. So I grab my catapult and a few rocks, and I go and make the cat's life uncomfortable, and that way the footling kangaroo or swamp wallaby doesn't get eaten by the cat. So I kill cats. If Gary in Mendham's only staying alive to feed his cats, you know, like, he's lucky we're not on the same continent, eh? So talking of suicide, you can't move on without dealing with it. Suicide has a bit of a fashionable dichotomy going on. On the one hand, it's really unfashionable to talk about it, and on the other hand, it's really, really fashionable to do it. Here in Australia, suicide is a leading cause of death for people, you know, 15 to 35. It's really savage. It's much worse than the road toll. And you've got to admit that, in a sense, suicide is the ultimate human right. If life is that bad, okay, you can remove yourself from the experience. Another way of looking at it is that suicide is a very permanent solution to a temporary problem. Now, when I was 21, I was performing fellatio on my grandfather's rifle barrel when I was alone, drunk, in my room in the nurse's home. And I had a near-death experience. Suddenly I was floating at ceiling height. I was looking down on a blood puddle on the floor, and I could see blood droplet spatter pattern on the walls, and the cleaning ladies came in and started talking in a Yugoslavian dialect, and I understood what they were saying, which was that it was a terrible shame that he'd killed himself over an argument with a girlfriend whose face he probably wouldn't have remembered if he'd just gone on living for another 5 years. And the next thing I knew, I was back in my body and I was spitting that gun barrel out of my mouth, and I've never tried to kill myself since. I haven't flirted with the idea. So that was when I was 21. My eldest stepson didn't make it to his 21st birthday, and that's a terrible personal tragedy that I'm still trying to come to grips with. You know, he hung himself. He thought life was that bad, and I've therefore perhaps done a little bit of research and study, and I've got a sticky mind, and I've picked up a few figures on suicide. Now, as far as I know, according to ABC Radio National News on the 14th of February 2010, when they carried the item in about 8 consecutive bulletins, the Melbourne University School of Medicine had some research covered by the Australian Medical Association Journal at about that time, where they covered a 30-odd year research program where they looked at 2,000 survivors of child sexual assault. And they looked long term at what happened to them. And it's not a very appetising picture, really. Survivors of child sexual assault have 18 times the death by suicide rate of their age cohort. Alright, 18 times the death by suicide rate. They have 48 times the death by accidental overdose rate of the background population. And the deaths cluster 18 years after the abusive event. Alright? Now, I was sucking on a gun barrel when I was 21. When I was 3, I was caught talking the pants off a 4-year-old girl. Right? My eldest stepson was 5 when I met him. He killed himself just before he got to be 21. I wonder what happened to him 2 years before I ever met him. I don't know, but surviving child sexual assault is the most powerful cause of suicide that I've ever heard of. Next one down the list is being the child of a combat veteran. Children of combat veterans have 3 times the suicide rate of their age cohort, and it goes on for the whole of their life. They also have 1.8 times the death by accident rate, 1.2 times the death by illness rate. Apparently, having post-traumatic stress disorder makes one an absolutely terrible parent. And combat veterans themselves, they have twice the suicide rate of the background population. And they also have twice the psychosis rate of the background population. So, on the scale of suicidal ideation, I would have to say that anti-natalists come in as looking as if they had a reckless, careless, negligent childhood, perhaps. But, you know, it wasn't as bad as going into combat. It wasn't as bad as being the child of a combat veteran. And it wasn't remotely as bad as having been sexually abused, right? They had a rough trot because their parents were busy working 3 jobs between the 2 parents to pay the mortgage or something. Or maybe they lived in a Brady bunch and nothing went tragically wrong. But no, they're not damaged enough to be suicidal. So, here we sit in 2011, in October, and we're on a planet that's population overshot, its biosphere's trashed, its resource depleted, the financial credit system is unwinding, and trade is imploding. So we've got a global economic halt staring us in the face, and that's with or without war, with or without plague, with or without solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Things are about to unwind. I saw this coming a while ago, you know, like I was preparing for World War III back in the early 1980s, and I expected it by the mid-80s, and I've spent 21 years paying rates on an endangered species sanctuary. And my personal conceit causes me to believe I've raised my kids to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. I have had a bit of success because for a while there the Burralong frogs, or Latoria burralongensis, on my place, descendants of the 12 I let loose here in 1996, elsewhere they were declared biologically extinct in 1998, and by the time Parks and Wildlife realised that they weren't biologically extinct, I had over 100,000 free-range Burralong frogs living on my place. So my game plan is to assist my descendants to outlive global warming. And when the petro-powered food chain shuts, my place has had 20 years of a rest, of getting over being farmed. And I've actually got some wild native food plants, and I might have a bit of a chance at living like a blackfella. Not as silly as I look, eh? In conclusion, I suppose my message to the anti-natalist is, you know, like, oh ye of little faith, don't give up. Life is not actually all misery. You can come back from a miserable situation. You can actually enjoy life by conserving life rather than sitting around there fixating on how bad everything is and prescribing death for everybody, which is, it's a terrible megalomaniacal thing to be doing. You know, you don't like life, therefore nobody's allowed to breed. That's basically what you guys are saying. I think it's an outrageous projection of your miserable, bitter, twisted, suffering view of the universe onto other people who live life in a different place, looking at it from a different perspective. And I'd also like to say how much I enjoyed seeing the film about the clay sculpture of Gary in Medham's existence. Even though I disagree with all these anti-natalist raves, as an eccentric, a loudmouthed oddball living in the forest, venting at the world, I empathise with Gary. I think he's quite good value, and I enjoy watching his videos, even though I can't really generally always afford the browser pack to watch all of them. And yeah, I'm sorry he's blocked me, because I would have enjoyed a bit of interaction, but he can't cope with any dissent. So there you go. Take it easy, anti-natalists. Life's not as bad as all that. Mad scientist versus anti-natalists, and the madness isn't dangerous, but the science is pretty good.